As we transition discussing verbal communication to talking about nonverbal communication, I do want to highlight the importance of reading the chapters in your textbook and not neglecting that responsibility as you progress through the course. We do have a test coming up in here and not too much more time, so I really want to encourage you in that regard. There's much more in the text than is referred to directly in the lecture, and that is because you can read, and if you have any questions of the material, I would be happy to address them, but please do make sure that you are reading the book as you progress along. We're moving on to talk about nonverbal communication. And one thing that I always enjoy thinking about and considering as I think about nonverbal communication is what happens when the verbal message and the nonverbal message are in tension with one another, when they contradict one another. For example, what if I started this lecture out and I said, "It's really great to be talking with you. I really hope that you can get excited about nonverbal communication." Now, my paralanguage did not communicate any enthusiasm whatsoever for discussing nonverbal communication, yet my verbal message did. So, you have to think about, when they're in tension with one another, which one do you believe? Which one do you give primacy to? And studies indicate that you're going to give primacy to nonverbal communication. So it's extremely important that you understand some of the assumptions, some of the functions, and the characteristics of nonverbal communication. Additionally, it's important that you understand that while approximately 65 to 75% of meaning is carried in our nonverbal messages, that's not to say that we interpret these messages very accurately most of the time. And in many cases, we end up ascribing motives to the other person. We end up giving primacy to a cue that can be very unintentional by the other person that really has nothing to do with even the communication encounter that you're having altogether. So it can be very confusing whenever we do this. Now, in terms of nonverbal communication, it can be intentional or unintentional in nature. There's a lot of things that we do nonverbally that are unintentional, and you might have some of those fidgety habits. Like, for example, people play with rings and jewelry, or they tug at clothes. And largely, these are going to be very unintentional behaviors. People aren't even aware that they're engaging in them. Sometimes we label them as being nervous behaviors, but sometimes people do this when they're not nervous at all. And there's other things that can be very unintentional. At the same time, though, we can have very intentional nonverbal communication where maybe we smile a certain way at somebody to indicate that we have romantic interest in them, or maybe we avoid them altogether to indicate we don't have romantic interest in them. Or think about the way that you present yourself, the clothing that you chose for a certain day. I mean, most people are pretty intentional when they choose clothing to say, like, to go to an interview. So nonverbal communication has a degree of intentionality to it. Nonverbal communication has a degree of ambiguity to it, in that unlike verbal communication, even though verbal communication can be very ambiguous, for example, the word early can mean something very different to you than it means to me, but nonverbal can, and maybe even to a greater degree in some cases, have a lot of ambiguity to it. And really this applies cross-culturally in significant ways, because we can have great levels of misunderstanding because we don't really know what's agreed upon in terms of the meaning for a particular cue. Also, nonverbal communication is usually primary over verbal communication. So when messages are in tension with one another, we tend to believe the nonverbal. Nonverbal communication is continuous. It is always going on, even when you're not speaking to someone. If you're around them, you're communicating to them through nonverbal channels. Also, nonverbal is multi-channeled in that it has components that we can view with our eyes and that we can listen to with our ears. And also, as you find out, you can layer on other types of sensory data through touch, which we call haptics, as well as through smell, which is olfactory, and even through taste to a certain degree. And nonverbal communication, just like verbal communication, must be understood in its context. In verbal communication, we call that the syntactic context. More specifically, In nonverbal communication, we just label this as being very contextual, and that you need to, in order to understand a nonverbal message, really visualize that message, understand that message within its context itself, the communication encounter, the occasion, the verbal message that you heard at the same time. So all that has an impact on the nonverbal message and how you interpret it. Now, furthermore, nonverbal has a lot of different functions that it serves within our relationships and our communication encounters. First of all, we actually relay a lot of information through nonverbal means. It can be very informational. We substitute information oftentimes through nonverbal rather than saying yes, we nod our head. Rather than saying no, we oftentimes nod our head the other way, right? Many people will give you a pat on the back rather than necessarily saying good job to you. There's lots of ways that we engage in substitution. Also, it being informational, we can emphasize certain points that we're trying to make so that people can understand the value that we place on a message and they get the value level of information. Also, we can contradict our verbal message intentionally or unintentionally and provide information that way. Nonverbal is also regulatory for our communication encounters. Lots of times people will actually regulate a conversation by their nonverbals if they want to speak. They may interrupt, or they may change their posture to lean forward a little bit more. As a teacher in the classroom, lots of times I can tell when someone wants to interject without them having to raise their hand or do anything formal, because they lean forward a little bit and they almost even open their mouth slightly as if they're ready to let something out. Regulatory also in terms of how we end conversations. Lots of times people will start to step away from you, so they will increase the physical distance between you and them in order to indicate they're ready to end a conversation. So we regulate conversations largely through nonverbal means. Also, it has an affective component to it, nonverbal does. It allows us to communicate emotions, but what's very interesting about this, not just the way that we express emotions, but also how we mask emotions. That is, we can intentionally control our nonverbal communication in order to mask what we're feeling to our relational partners. Also, through our nonverbal communication, we engage in image management, and this can be seen quite easily if you just look at how people dress, the artifacts and accessories that they choose to carry with them on their person, and a variety of other ways as well. Also, our nonverbal communication can be expressive of our power and control. I mean, how many people have maybe an artifact or an accessory that is a status symbol? They got it because of the label that it has on it. Also, your nonverbal communication is finally repetitive. And that is, we can repeat key information through nonverbal means in order to get our point across. I have a 3-year-old. Sometimes words are just not enough, and I repeat with a nonverbal. For example, if I'm telling him, no, that's not appropriate, I'm shaking my head at the same time, no, to give a clear indication of what I mean. So that introduces you to some of the functions of nonverbal communication.